This episode of SalmonCast is sponsored by Pride of Bristol Bay. From our nets to your door, we provide you with sockeye salmon in fillets and portions in 5, 10, and 20-pound cases. Podcast listeners get 10% off their first order when you use the code PODCAST at checkout. That's prideofbristolbay.com, promo code PODCAST. Welcome to SalmonCast, the podcast about wild adventures fueled by wild seafood. And we're back with the next part of our series of getting to know Steve and Jenn. And in last episode, we wrapped up with Steve's first season as a captain, which was actually his second season total in Bristol Bay, and Jenn's first season as a deckhand. So picking up right there, the years after that, how did things develop for the two of you in regards to making a career or a job at that time, if that's how it felt, because you were only there for the summer? But what was your strategy moving forward after that second season? Like, were you pretty much sure that you were going to keep going back after experiencing that season?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there was ever a season that, until we actually invested in the bay and bought our own boat and permit, to you're like, well, I'm going to go back next year. It was always like you leave there hating the place and coming back in the spring because you're like, I don't want to miss it. And so I don't really think that there was never a strategy. Like, that's what I look back on, like, but the whole business life development, there's never been a strategy. It's been, we love the work, we love the outdoors, and we want to have fun while we're doing that stuff. So you just kind of have like crafted this life going forward, and I've never said like, I want to be this, I want to do that. And it's just always been like, what's the opportunity? And I always have felt that I could give up the job I have today and I could just start back. Like there's never been a fear for me of like not having a job. Like feel like you're always in demand. So you take that off the table.
That was part of my next question was, have you ever thought back to like where you're at today with the businesses that you own, and like wondered like if you didn't go to Idaho to take that job, like what you would be doing instead of, like, your whole life is surrounded by salmon now in Bristol Bay, like to the extreme. So like, what do you think about how all those things aligned to where it takes you back when you look back at it now?
Yeah, I mean, the right connections, the right people, and I never said no. Like, that's the thing that's, to me, is different when I look at a lot of people when I'm interviewing, or just, like how people go through life, is like opportunities show up. We never said no. We just kept like advancing and moving forward and like taking the challenge on. And so you just kind of end up in some neat place someday.
Yeah. Even the sort of the way the web goes, after the first or second year on the boat, when we brought the salmon back, just having the connection of John Hopkins or somebody saying, hey, you should try to sell that, or, how can I get some? And how it just, one connection or one opportunity can just go in so many different directions.
So can you expound upon that story a little bit as to when you brought salmon back and how it sparked, or how did events transpire to you and Steve saying, hey, like, maybe we should keep doing this, bringing it back and selling it, and how it transpired from there?
Yeah. Well, actually, it started on the beach when we were set netting. Steve filleted a whole bunch of fish on the beach. We packed them in a cooler and we brought them home. And we even smoked some salmon in a pallet. What was that? A box? Maybe?
Yeah, they're wooden boxes, a shipping box. You just take a pallet and surround it.
It's like a crate.
Plywood.
Yeah. So we smoked some salmon in the crate and packed it up in a cooler and brought it home. And, you can see piques everybody's interest with the story and the product. And not everybody wants to eat it with the bones in and sand from the beach and all of that kind of thing. So, the next year when Steve started captaining, we brought some fillets back that had been filleted at the processor, a few more than the year before. And with the forestry connection that Steve had, he knew John Hopkins from Orangeville, who had Forks Farm, and he had a farm market on his property, and he offered for us to come sell fillets there at the market.
How many fillets had you brought back?
We had 3 coolers. I flew home with 3 coolers, and when you often say like, what like event could have changed where we ended up, I often think back of in Newark at the airport, a lady wanted to buy the 3 coolers off me when I told her that there was salmon in them. She was just like this random question of like, you're standing in the at the line getting your luggage, and she's like, "What do you have in there?" And I was like, "Wild Alaskan salmon." And she's like, "I'll buy them." And I was like, "Yeah, right. Like these are for my family." And like, but what happens if I would have just said, "Yeah, like I'll take $50 a cooler," like, and that would have been like, "Hey, I got $150 and gone home," and you would have never got the opportunity to then, because I worked with John as a forest consultant at that time, and we were eating lunch in the woods, and I was telling him about the fish that I had brought back, and he's like, "Well, why don't you and Jen bring that to my farmer's market?" And then that's what kind of like made it happen. And I can like still vividly like we made a cardboard sign on a popsicle stick that said like wild salmon $7.99. It was just like,
did you have any reference of like market value or did you just like name your price for what you thought was fair?
We just put a price on it. I mean, I've never sold, like, to that point I never sold anything but my sweat, so it was like it was just like I felt so weird like sitting there selling something because I'd never done that before.
So what was the initial reaction to the people that bought from that initial farm market?
It was really good because
positive, yeah.
Because they were like, John had crafted a crowd of really food intricate people, and so they were educated and knowledgeable on it. We were not. Like, growing up, my father had a custom butcher shop, and like, so we pretty much produced all our own food. So like I never dealt with going to the grocery store and buying fish. We went to the shore and we'd catch our own fish, we'd catch our own trout. And like, I think it's an interesting thing that I've thought back on is like, I have not experienced like going to the store until I was like in college. And I can remember some of the first times going to the store and like looking and being like, wow, this is what's to offer. Like, how spoiled have I been my whole life to have a butcher shop in the backyard?
Right.
When we were living in Kamei, I'd have to go to the grocery store because all Steve would come home with is a loaf of bread and peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah.
So taking us one step back then, when was both of your first experiences eating wild Alaskan salmon? Was it that first year?
Yeah, at fish camp, Hunt's wife, Letty, she's Malaysian and an amazing cook.
Amazing.
And so we had salmon curry, like we had salmon every way. That's what all they cooked was salmon. And
were you both like into seafood before that point, or was that kind of like, how did it compare? If so, how did it compare to what you had experienced prior?
Yeah, I mean, I always ate seafood growing up, going to the shore, but never appreciated it that way. I think there was a turning point there where like you realize the quality of fish and how good it is, and like kind of how much you want to consume. And then also like when you go to Bristol Bay and you experience this like amazing migration of fish, like there's a whole other set of energy that fish brings to you, other than, just the dollars you make from catching it, or there's just this energy that it has because it's been feeding people for thousands of years. The subsistence native culture has been living off this, and it's a cycle. And I think that, like, for me, that really gets in your blood.
So then fast forwarding back to that first farmer's market, what was if any, what was the strategy with moving forward with going and fishing and bringing back product?
I don't know that we really had a strategy. I guess the way that it ended up was um, each year when we would go back up, we would bring almost double what we brought back the year before. And so it was still manageable. We were still both working full-time other jobs. But we could attend these events on the weekends and have enough time to communicate with customers. And it just sort of grew organically that way, which made it manageable.
And then the early years of what's now known as Wild for Salmon started out of your house, just operating as the farmers markets. Were there any other ways other than the farmers markets in the early years that you were distributing product to customers?
Yes. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, the buying clubs came out of the farmers markets because, we started to get invited to different farmers markets. And then we would, or go to some kind of conference. And so we started the buying clubs, and then they would kind of like allow people to stock up for the year. And so they'd have one time to buy. And then we kind of switched it to 2 times a year to buy, once in the fall and once in the spring. And so that really allowed us to like expand outside of the area and grow the brand and the interest in the products. We were doing farmers markets, and then buying clubs kind of like piggybacked on them to make sure that it continued. And then once we got to like roughly, I think we sold about 30,000 pounds, and there's a cold storage about 20 minutes away, and we kept the product there. And then we had some freezers at our house, so we drive up there and get the product, and then not package it, but just box it and make sure everything was good. We check every box and make sure there's no broken seals. Like, we were super into we've always been super into the quality aspect of it. And then at that point, we ended up buying the brick and mortar in Bloomsburg, and just for a storage facility, and opened up the retail store just in a little 12 by 12 room that was in the front, that was already there, and just put a freezer in there, and was just like, we'll see what happens.
But we just, the Wild for Salmon has many, many, many products now, and we started with one whole fillet in a case of fillets or a case of portions 15 years ago. And so the buying club model allowed for us to quickly distribute those cases. And then we wouldn't need to see that customer often like a farmer's market customer, because they have their freezer nicely stocked. So once people started asking for smaller quantities, or getting different varieties, that's when it was a blessing almost to have that brick and mortar store and more freezer space to.
Did you find the early years of like marketing the business difficult, of like how you sold people in northeastern Pennsylvania, like got them to buy into buying Alaskan seafood? And like, in my brain, the way my brain works would always be like that people would be skeptical that it was really from Alaska, because we're so far away from Alaska.
No, I think the story, I think it was pretty obvious, the story, and people like the authenticity of us fishing was it just broke the barrier down on what you're talking about. And they were like, they didn't even question, like, they took our word that it was what we were saying it was, and it was the best. And so what they, back in the early 2000s, what they could find in the grocery store was pretty poor quality. Since then, the quality has risen across the board, from the fishermen to the processors, and it's really a different product. So like, entering the game now, I think there's more opportunities for anybody to find good quality seafood delivered to their door in the supermarkets than there was back then. So we were kind of like the only ones. Mm-hmm. And so there was energy. Like, there was never a farmer's market that was like, nah, we're not taking you. They were like, yeah, we want you.
Right. Right.
I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Bloomsburg with a graphic designer guy that I thought was nuts. But, of course we were like looking, we are not marketers. So we were looking for somebody to come up with a way to tell the story. This was before social media and all of that fun stuff. So I remember he made us an 8-page almost like a pamphlet book. Like, but when I think back, it just makes me laugh because that we were like in uncharted waters. Like we didn't know,
Right,
we would take anybody's advice. But
how
it's gotta
different?
somewhere,
How
but-
different were those early graphics to what exists today?
Oh, quite a bit different.
Yeah.
It was a spawn. It was like this mean spawned out male salmon that was, red and jumping and like gritty, and then quickly we were like, we used that for a while, but then we realized that like as a fisherman and a sport fisherman, like that's a cool looking fish.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're buying seafood, like you want to represent it in the pristine, like quality of when we catch it, when it's still ocean run.
Right. So then as the years progressed, when was the first conversation, if you remember, early conversation about like purchasing a boat and like taking the next step of commitment?
I think Bryce probably was looking to get rid of his boat.
I'm trying to think of when we bought that. We had to buy it in 2007 is when we bought it.
Okay.
So basically I'd continued to fish, and Jen had fished, I can't remember the years exactly without looking at them, but like there was off and on. She went back to grad school, missed a couple summers, but I continued to fish and was like, this is, I was making decent money for the summer, was loving it. Like it was working with my combination of tree care, selling salmon in the fall and the winter, and then fishing in the summer. Jen had a full-time teaching gig, so she was like okay with that. I was still kind of drifting between like any kind of occupation or like course to be on. But I think for me, I always think back of it as it must have been the 2006 season, and I got done fishing, and I remember calling up the guys that I fished with and was like, I got to make a decision on whether I'm going to keep commercial fishing or not. And I didn't never fish for the money. Like I've really never done anything for the money. Like I've always just done it because I love to be working. And so it's not like I was sitting there saying, I want to do this because I can see where we're going to be financially down the road. It was like, I want to do this because I love it and I'm having fun. So I remember reaching out to a couple of the guys and saying like, how much money did you make on your worst season as a fisherman? And when in our early days, it was pretty poor. They were paying, 50 cents a pound. The runs were small. So, I made $1,500 my first season. I think I made $5,400 my second season. And so like we started at the bottom and loved what we were doing. And then as we went on, the demand for wild salmon grew, and the price started to come up. The runs got bigger again. And so we started to make better money. And, but I asked the question of what the like worst seasons were. And I just kind of off the cuff, it was like, oh, I'm, had an engine blow up and only fished 2/3 of the season and I made $30,000. And, another guy had another story and it was like 40,000 and somebody else was 50,000. And like, there was a light bulb right then that was like, well, wait a minute. Everybody that I know is either going to work in the woods or in the coal mine for $30,000 or $40,000 all year. I'm like, this is real. Like, this is interesting. Mm-hmm. And so that was for me, like the kind of point that was like, okay, let's think about this.
And then, so the family that you originally fished for was selling their second boat.
Yes.
And
so
that would be the first boat that you two purchased.
Yeah, the fishing vessel RJ, so Romeo and Juliet. Funny enough, but so I was kind of getting fed up with fishing for somebody and being under their thumb. I was starting to get my own wings and ready to go, if you will. And so Bryce didn't have anybody to sell the boat to within the family, and that didn't work out. So he knew I was going to go. And so he was like, well, why don't you buy the boat on 2 payments and I'll sell it to you 50% this year and 50% next year. I'm like, okay, I can swing that. And then we needed a permit, and we had, they were $78,000 at that point. So you buy them once and then you own it. And so I was like, how do I get $78,000 to buy a permit. And you can't, if you're outside of Alaska, you can't finance it through a bank. You have to be a resident of Alaska to finance through a bank at that time anyway. I don't know if it's changed. And so Jen and I had built our own house from scratch. And so we realized that there was equity in the house since we had built it over a course of a year and pretty much paid it all cash down. So we had equity and got a loan for the permit and financed our house to buy the first permit.
And then, so we'll go back to that in a minute, I think, that particular portion. And then, so once you purchased the first boat, the used boat, like you were kind of 100% in, where was the store or selling the salmon at that point when you purchased the boat?
It would have been out of our house. We were just kind of like bumping along, probably selling 15,000 pounds that year or something like that.
No employees.
So the brick and mortar didn't exist yet.
Right. Yeah. So we could shut down for the spring,
right,
go fishing, and come back with fresh product.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was awesome in the early days because it was just Jen and I, and you'd be sold out by February, and then you're like, don't have any more fish to sell, and then you'd kind of like go to explore, do whatever till spring, and then head to Alaska.
And fast forward, now you're funding your own podcast. SalmonCast is a production of Kurian Fisheries. The show is hosted by Steve Kurian and Dustin Hamilton. Produced by Dustin Hamilton, Courtney Rainford, and Aubrey McNeil.